the Gospel of Mark. We're going to start with the exercise on slide 1. Where does Mark's Gospel begin compared to the other Gospels? Please pause the video at this point so that you can answer the question. Where does Mark's Gospel begin compared to the other Gospels? Well, Mark starts his Gospel with the ministry of John the Baptist, followed by the baptism of Jesus and then the temptations of Jesus, and then quickly moves into Jesus' ministry. In contrast, Matthew and Luke begin with the birth narratives, with Jesus' birth. And John, in his Gospel, starts with Jesus with God the Father in eternity past. Introducing Mark's Gospel. Mark's Gospel is the shortest of the 4 Gospels. And many scholars believe that Mark was the first Gospel to be written. It can probably be dated to the late 50s or early 60s. That's within 20 to 30 years of Jesus' death and resurrection. And if tradition is correct, it was written in Rome. Church tradition suggests that the Gospel was written by John Mark, who you may remember was one of Paul's missionary team in the book of Acts, and that this Gospel was written because of information that was given to John Mark from the Apostle Peter. So, for example, Papias, writing in around about 125 AD, suggests that Mark was the author of this Gospel because of information that had apparently been passed on from the Apostle John. Papias states that Mark himself was not an eyewitness of these events, of the life of Jesus, but that he had obtained his information from Peter, and that the Gospel was written for the church in Rome. Well, we can't be absolutely sure, this is a church tradition, but certainly it seems to be written with Gentiles in mind, with non-Jews in mind. Mark, for example, doesn't discuss Jewish Old Testament law. And on a number of occasions, he explains Jewish traditions, or he translates Aramaic words for people who might not understand Aramaic into Greek. He seems to be writing his Gospel for a non-Jewish audience. Mark doesn't include anywhere an explicit statement of purpose in his Gospel. But it's clear from the Gospel itself that Mark is interested in the idea of the kingdom of God coming in Jesus' ministry. And he's interested in the idea that Jesus is Isaiah's suffering servant who dies for the sins of the people. About 2/3 of Mark's Gospel describes Jesus' ministry in Galilee up north. But 1/3 of the Gospel is devoted to the story of the cross and focuses on 1 week in Jerusalem down south. Mark's focus in this Gospel is on the suffering and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And Mark particularly emphasizes in this Gospel Jesus' teaching on radical discipleship. He makes it clear that following Jesus will cost his disciples everything. And Mark loves the action of the story. One of his favourite words is immediately. So Jesus did this, and then immediately he went on to do something else. His gospel moves at a very fast pace. And in this gospel, Mark focuses more on what Jesus did than what Jesus taught. The other gospels contain much longer sections of Jesus' teaching than Mark does. It's also important to realize that the words of Mark chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, which are included in modern translations in one way or another, those verses right at the end of Mark's Gospel are not found in the earliest and most reliable manuscripts. And therefore, they are probably not part of the original Gospel. They were not written by Mark. That means that Mark's Gospel ends rather abruptly with the women's discovery of the empty tomb of Jesus. It's been estimated that only 7% of Mark's Gospel is unique to his Gospel. In other words, almost all of the material in Mark's Gospel can be found in the other Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke. Mark's Gospel is often regarded as the most basic Gospel, and therefore it's a useful Gospel to use with people who have no knowledge of the Bible. But don't be fooled by its simplicity. It also has great theological depth. What's the structure of Mark's Gospel? Well, Mark can be divided into two major sections, with Peter's confession of Jesus as the Christ in Mark chapter 8 as the sort of turning point of the Gospel. Just look at diagram 1 in your notes. The first 8 chapters deal with the question of Jesus' identity. Who is Jesus? Then in chapter 8, it's revealed that Jesus is the Messiah, he's the Christ. And then the rest of the Gospel explores the question from chapter 8 onwards, what does it mean to be the Messiah? What is this mission that God has given Jesus? And then related to that first question, what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus, the Messiah? So the first section, Mark chapters 1 to 8, focuses primarily on Jesus' miracles that uniquely display his authority in various ways. Those chapters describe the calling of the early disciples. They answer this question of who is Jesus? And in this section of Mark's Gospel, Mark frequently groups together stories and sayings of Jesus with a common theme. But then with chapter 8 and Peter's confession, that the focus shifts. Jesus immediately begins to teach about his coming suffering and his death. And then the second half of this gospel focuses on Jesus' teaching, especially Jesus teaching his disciples. In this section, the story seems to move a bit more chronologically than before. From Mark chapter 8, everything moves towards the cross, which dominates the rest of the book. As we finish, please notice the outline in your notes for Mark's Gospel.